I don't think you have any idea how fast I really am. I'm fast as fuck, boy.
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Gauss, and first things first, let's go over the builds. So with Gauss, I have one build split two different ways, a health tank and a shield gate variant. The first build is a health tank build running adaptation. Gauss's second ability, Kinetic Plating, gives up to 100% damage reduction from most damage types that you will take, meaning that if you're doing a shorter mission, you actually don't even need adaptation, and instead you can replace it with something like Umbral Intensify for more damage on Thermal Sunder and more damage on your Nourish, or you can give yourself more duration via Constitution to buff your Redline, as Redline scales entirely with duration. You can see whenever I take off Constitution, the numbers go down, and if I put on Umbral Intensify, the numbers stay the same. But since I was doing longer missions, I was choosing to use Adaptation. Streamline is another flex slot, and you can instead choose to replace this for either of those two mods of Constitution or Umbral Intensify, but I preferred having the little bit of extra ability efficiency. You don't need it to sustain, but what it does is it allows you to just spam the absolute crap out of Thermal Sunder whenever you do have your Redline at 100%. Now, as for subsumes, I was running Nourish, as Nourish scales really well with Gauss, as again, it gives you infinite energy, but it also has the exact same explosion radius as Thermal Sunder does. This means that you can run Combat Discipline to damage yourself on kill to self proc the Nourish explosion, staggering enemies, which works really well with Cold Thermal Sunder, as your cold is slowing them down, similar to Gloom, and Nourish is staggering them, and the stagger is then extended based on the cold procs. But then you're also just AoE applying Viral whenever you kill an enemy as well, which is very, very strong. It's not as good as it sounds, as Nourish's explosion is unfortunately affected by line of sight. Gauss can also freely run Arcane Avenger for 45% flat crit chance, even without Combat Discipline, because whenever you take damage from enemies, even with 100% DR from Kinetic Plating, and even if you have a shield, it will still count as health damage for some reason and proc Arcane Avenger, which is very, very good. Alternatively, if you don't want to use Arcane Avenger for whatever reason, Molt Augmented is of course always good for more damage on Thermal Sunder, even though it doesn't need it, or Molt Efficiency for more duration for Redline, but again, you really don't need it, which is why I was just using Avenger for the crit chance. Another thing to mention is the range, which I will talk about briefly. A lot of people think that you need to run a lot of range on a Gauss Thermal Sunder build, but you really don't, and in fact it actually hurts you more than it helps. See, you're only nuking the map with Thermal Sunder 30% of the time, as that is the most that you can have Redline at 100%. The rest of the mission, you're going to be running around spamming Cold Thermal Sunder, so if you have too much range, you'll just be hard CCing enemies, and your KPM will just go down to nothing. Even on some tile sets, I found that 190% range was too much, and my KPM was just suffering a lot because of it. So you want to play with the range to your liking, but again, just make sure you don't overdo it. The problem is worsened if you're playing with a group, and they are being hallway warriors running between a bunch of different tiles, as then you're going to be leaving enemies behind that are hard CC'd, and obviously that will prevent future enemies from spawning, again just plummeting your KPM, and it can ruin your survival run, make you have to pick up all the life support modules, etc, etc. As for the second build, it is just a shield gate variant, running Blind Rage to lower our efficiency to shield gate without Brief Respite. However, you don't have to do this, you can just run Brief Respite and drop Blind Rage and change the build a little bit. And as for the rest of the build, I was using a Tenet Tetra, as the Tenet Tetra works very well with Gauss, as it is normally balanced by using a lot of ammo, which you can use Primed Rifle Ammo Mutation to mitigate, and the rest of your kit to kill enemies if you do run out of ammo. But it's also balanced on its slow fire rate and long reload speed. But Gauss gives both fire rate and reload speed making up for the negatives of the Tenet Tetra. The Tenet Tetra does a lot of damage, has one of the longest AoEs in the largest AoEs in the game, with one of the lowest fall-offs in the game. Normally you have to slot like primed fast hands for reload speed, but with Gauss you don't have to, and this slot gets freed up for either a Riven or something like primed Firestorm for an even larger AoE. Also with Arcane Avenger, it pushes the Tenet Tetra to above 100% crit chance, which is again very, very strong. Other primaries work very well with Gauss, such as the Archoplasmor, because again it really wants reload speed and fire rate, and it gets above 100% crit chance as well with Arcane Avenger. Something like the Kuvazar works really well with Gauss, and something like the Bubonico works really well with Gauss. As for the secondary, you are absolutely trolling if you use anything other than the Nucor when using Arcane Avenger as your secondary, so I was using the Nucor. If you aren't going a Shield Gate build, you can drop the Augur mods for Lethal Torrent, for more fire rate and multi-shot, and then of course a Bane mod over Augur Seeker to multiply your damage by 55% after all of your other mods, and then also double dip on status effects. As for the melee, it is just a Praetos build for the parkour velocity and sprint speed. Focus School is Madurai for the 40% ability strength, 50% casting speed, and Phoenix Talons passive. However, Gauss really doesn't need Madurai, so feel free to use any Focus School you want on him. Last but not least is the Panzer build with the synth mods equipped. Now, moving on to the rankings, we're discussing Gauss in relation to 4 topics. Firstly is KPM, secondly is survivability, thirdly is viability, and finally how fun he is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path bot run with no Spectres, on-call, and no Archon shards. Now let's begin with the first topic, his KPM. Gauss has the ability to reach incredibly high KPM through the usage of Thermal Sunder spam once you have 100% redline. Due to the nature of how redline works, you will only have 100% redline for 30% of the mission at your absolute maximum. This means for 30% of the mission, you can run around spamming Heat Thermal Sunder and combining it into Blast, one-shotting enemies with incredibly good scaling, which does go up to level cap. Due to the nature of how Thermal Sunder works, you are spamming Heat procs, which double each time you cast them, and then whenever you combine it into Blast, it armor strips the enemies and then multiplies the damage even further, working similarly to Expedite Suffering. While this is incredibly nice, do keep in mind that you can only do this for 30% of the mission. In the other 70% of the mission, you're running around spamming an incredibly strong CC ability in Cold Thermal Sunder and only killing with your guns. And not only are you only killing with your guns, but you don't have access to a armor strip, meaning that you will eventually fall off and not be able to kill Eximus units, as Eximus units are incredibly overtuned currently. This means while he does have really nice scaling for 30% of the mission, the other 70% of the mission, he only has a tiny bit of scaling. I will give Gauss an S rank for his KPM, and the reason I don't believe he deserves an S plus is just because he doesn't have quite enough scaling in my opinion to deserve the S plus rank for KPM. Now moving on to the second topic, his survivability, and Gauss's survivability is incredibly strong as well. The reason for this is because of 3 things. First, you are spamming Cold Thermal Sunder again, and people really don't value cold procs. Even now that it's been buffed, people still don't see the value of cold procs. But think of it like this. A single cold proc now is almost equivalent to a 200% strength gloom snare. And you're running around spamming it, which means that it stacks to get even stronger than that. But it's also a lingering field that you're applying. So, Cold Slow is incredibly strong. Do not underestimate it. Not only that, but if you cast Cold Thermal Sunder twice on the same enemy, you actually hard CC them. So, you're running around spamming an ability that pretty much just AoE applies a 200% Gloom Snare and hard CCing them on second cast. That is very, very nice for your survivability. But that's not all. because you're also running Nourish, which anytime you kill an enemy, releases an AoE within 22 meters of you that will also stun or stagger any enemy within your line of sight. Since the enemies are also snared by like 70%, this means that that stagger that you're applying is also lengthened to be even longer, increasing your survivability even further. And all of that being said, that's still not mentioning one of the strongest parts, which is his second ability, which gives you damage reduction to the main damage types that you will be afflicted with, of impact, puncture, slash, heat, and cold. Almost all of the damage that you take on this game is one of those 5 things. Oh, it also affects blast, which is also useful, as bombards also are one of the things that will just outright one-shot you if you're running a health tank build. This means that Gauss is one of the best health tanks in the entire game, due to the fact that 30% of the mission, he's just outright invincible, and for the rest of the mission, he still has adaptation and at least some DR from his second ability to fall back on. And even if you're not running a health tank build, like say you're running a shield gate build, being immune to damage as a shield gate build for 30% of the mission is still really strong. So because of the fact that he's applying a large amount of AoE cold procs, hard CCing the map anytime you double cast Thermal Sunder, which again, the entire mission, that's what you're doing. The fact that you're staggering enemies with Nourish anytime you kill an enemy, due to running Combat Discipline to self-damage yourself, and the fact that you can be outright invincible with the second ability, I have to give his survivability rank an S+. Now, moving on to the third topic, his viability. And his viability is the first topic where I think he falls off a bit, as far as I'm aware, I could be wrong here, I do not think that there's anywhere in the game where you really want a Gauss. On the flip side, there's also nowhere in the game where having a Gauss is bad, but he's just not great at any particular thing. And again, on the plus side, he's also above average at excavation, and I really like using excavation as an example for Warframe's viability, because excavation, in my opinion, is like the absolute hardest mission type in the game to actually stay in for a lengthy period of time. And Gauss has the ability to at least semi do well in that mission, again due to the fact of having cold thermal sunder spam. But outside of that, he's just slightly above average in all of the mission types, due to the fact that obviously thermal sunder spam is really good, and having just raw DR is good, and high sprint speed is good. But it's just not spectacular. Like, if there's somewhere that he's actually really good in, let me know, but I think he's just a slightly above viable Warframe, so I will give him a B+ rank for his viability. Now, moving on to his fun, and this is where he fell off for me, but I will be fair here. So, for some reason, I'm not sure what it is, but playing Gauss gave me a legitimate migraine, and I'm not sure why. At first, I thought I just wasn't feeling well, so I took a break and came back and played him the next day, and still within 20 minutes of playing him, I had a massive headache. I don't know if it's because you have to like micromanage the gauge and worry about it all the time. I don't know what it was, but I wasn't having the most fun playing him. On top of that, I really dislike the fact that 2 of your abilities are just buffs that you press and they just last for 40 seconds. I find that incredibly boring. And I also really do not enjoy Thermal Sunder. I'm not sure if this is because it's so overused and you use it on pretty much any Warframe that you're taking to ESO, SO, or just base star chart, but I also don't like Thermal Sunder. And his first ability is very fun. Like, his first ability is by far the most fun part of his kit, but it's also the only ability in his kit that doesn't do anything, so it's what you drop for Helmuth, which is just unfortunate. All of that being said, even though I didn't particularly enjoy his kit too much, I do like the fact that his 4 gives you reload speed and fire rate, and it gives a lot of it meaning that a lot of weapons that aren't really viable elsewhere suddenly become viable. The main one is, of course, the Tenet Tetra, which is what I was using anytime I was playing Gauss. See, the Tenet Tetra is held back by its long reload speed, amplified by its slow fire rate, which fire rate does affect its reload speed, by the way. And the fact that Gauss gives both of those things means that the Tenet Tetra has the ability to shine, whereas otherwise it's pretty mediocre. And it's not just the Tenet Tetra. You can use literally a million different weapons, especially since that he's a really good candidate for using Arcane Avenger for 45% flat crit rate. That really widens his pool of weapons he can use, which does make him fun in the sense that anytime you get bored of a specific weapon loadout, you can essentially pick any weapon in the game and it will work well. Because you have Nourish, you have a reload speed buff, you have 45% flat crit, and you have fire rate. So there's at least that. So I will give him a B rank for his fun, despite the fact that I didn't particularly enjoy his playstyle. He at least has a broad weapon pool to choose from. In conclusion, Gauss is an A+ tier Warframe, but there are some arguments to be made for him to be ranked even higher. If you do not plan on doing missions longer than an hour, or you just found him more fun to play than I did, I wouldn't really be shocked at an S- or an S ranking.